For those that don't know, I'm the executive director of Devils River Conservancy. Um, we work within a 2.5 million acre basin, generally around Southwest Texas, centered on the county of Val Verde County and extending to counties around. We work on behalf of the Devils River, but we're also a regional facilitator and convener, and we work predominantly to protect the Devils River, but also to share resources and to work collaboratively with ranchers, landowners, and stakeholders throughout the region. Um, we thank you for being here today. And I am going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker to kick off this webinar. Andrew Earl is the Director of Conservation with Texas Wildlife Association, our good partners at TWA. Andrew has previously served in roles with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership and as a legislative assistant in the U.S. Senate in D.C. Andrew, I'm going to bring you in and ask you to go ahead and round out the introduction of yourself there and go ahead and give us a brief primer on New World Screwworm if you're ready.
Absolutely. Thanks, Romey. Let me get my screen up here. Just a second. We'll be off and running. All right. Well, thank you, Romey, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Very much appreciate the time and the ability to chat with you all. Uh, Similar to Devils River Conservancy, Texas Wildlife Association is an organization serving landowners. Only our reach is statewide. Our membership is about 8,000 that own, steward, and manage upwards of 35 million acres of working lands and habitats across the state. Obviously, a great deal of overlap, particularly when it comes to New World Screwworm, and our concern here with a lot of our partners in animal agriculture. This is an issue that we've dealt with before as a state, and we're gearing up to once more. So appreciate the chance to talk with you today. And I'll dive right in. New World Screwworm is a blowfly, and we'll start really here at the 101 level. I'm going to give a bit of a primer, and then we'll let Dr. Swiger, who's the real expert on our panel today, uh, dive into to some of the science and what exactly the government response looks like. But New World Screwworm is a blowfly that infests and infects the tissue of warm-blooded mammals. So in Texas, the greatest economic concern is that of livestock and animal agriculture, but also wildlife. We have a hunting and recreation economy that is built on the back of our native wildlife, and and is both a tremendous economic and ecological concern. It's also a human concern, and there have been human cases of screwworm infestations. Actually, last year there was a case of a tourist coming back from the Caribbean that flew into Baltimore, Maryland, and had a screwworm infestation, I believe, in his nasal cavity. He was quickly quarantined, and that case resolved. Um, but that is an aspect of this issue that we need to be careful about, particularly in the wildlife and livestock communities. I think certainly, we run the risk of losing control of the narrative should there be an outbreak of or even multiple instances of human cases of New World Screwworm. Of course, a concern in South Texas and in other places where there are unhoused individuals that don't necessarily have immediate access to medical care. So we'll dive in with a little bit of history. I should mention too, there's a aspect of there's a great challenge too with wildlife in that's different than humans and in animal agriculture, in that we're not necessarily putting our hands on these animals every day, which makes surveillance and treatment all that much more difficult. So the screwworm was a fact of life in the mid to late 20 into the mid to late 20th century, and that really dictated how ranching practices were carried out. You know, timelines related to calving, lambing, docking, and branding animals were all kind of all revolved around the screwworm. Um, that was really until the 1950s when research actually at a USDA ARS research lab in Kerrville proved out this novel sterile insect technique um, that that allowed for the mass breeding and release of screwworm flies to combat the wildfly populations. That was proved out in Florida and then came to Texas. Um, Previously, there were treatments available, a lot of caustic treatment applications that ranchers would keep in saddlebags and treat livestock with. Um, the screwworm was officially eradicated from the United States in 1966. However, there were infestations for well over another decade. Um, in a decade later, in Texas, 1976, there were reported 1.5 million cattle infestations and infestations in over 300,000 sheep and goats. Um, that we'll get a little bit more into what that looked like in as far as mortality and lost value and costs to producers here in a moment. But since that time, since the 1960s and 70s, the USDA has successfully operated a sterile fly rearing and distribution facility in Panama in coordination with the Panamanian government. That facility is 90% funded by the United States government and produces about 100 million flies a week. That is our current capacity for sterile fly production in North America. I'm sure Dr. Swiger will talk about some of the other resources that are going to be coming online here in the next couple of years. But that facility in Panama is like a warship. Runs 24 hours a day. It is a biosecure facility with backups for every part and machine on site so that it can keep operating. It has been successful in making that land gap there by the Darien Gap, a kind of an airlock against screwworm reinfestations into Central and North America for the last several decades. Um, a consequence of that is that we in the United States have gotten pretty comfortable. There's a generation of lost knowledge and experience on New World screwworm flies and control methods. Um, there's been a prohibition on import of the fly that has limited our ability to carry out research. And so the USDA sends one researcher down to Panama for a 3-year stint to work down at that facility and do some of that entomological research. Um, but a lot of that built infrastructure has gone by the wayside as well. Sterile insect facilities in Texas and Mexico, retrofitted, used for other purposes. Um, and we have found ourselves in the last few years as this uh, has as we've seen a reemergence of the fly in Central America, playing a little bit of catch up. And so there's been a lot of question as to how this came about. Um, so that airlock in Panama, as we're calling it, or a stopgap, that the cork in the bottle in Panama has broken down in the last few years. Um, and this is a consequence of a handful of different factors. Um, Deforestation for domestic herds in Panama, to graze domestic herds in Panama. Illegal livestock movement and illegal cattle trafficking, increased human migration through the area, northward human migration, adaptation in the wild of the some of the strains that were being used at the Copeg facility, and then another big one is fewer cattle inspections. Um, and fewer cattle inspections and checkpoints during COVID era policies. So this is not an exhaustive list. This is not there's not, I don't think any one of these factors in particular that brought this about, our current circumstance, but certainly I think that the culmination of them is has brought us to where we are. So since 2022, we have seen a slow northward reemergence of the new world screwworm, ultimately reaching Mexico in November of 2024. And so this has been facilitated largely by the movement of livestock. Um, once you can see there are these two thresholds, primary and secondary thresholds, just inside Mexico. Those are checkpoints. Essentially, once the screwworm got past there, Mexican livestock is not regionalized in many ways, and so it was from there it had kind of broken contain, and we've seen spot fires of screwworm infestations moving northward for the better part of well, for the last 18 months. In May 2025, the USDA suspended livestock imports, closed the border for livestock imports, and the result has really been a massive consolidation of the livestock industry in Mexico. Livestock that were sent into the U.S. to be to feedlots to be finished. It kind of found a glut in northern Mexico. In a lot of ways, that has been a boon for the cartels that own a lot of the meatpacking industry in Mexico. They're more than happy to package to slaughter and package that meat and then send it to the United States there. So it is really caused a political and an economic headache in a lot of ways in Mexico. And a big challenge that persists is that of in wildlife. This is a USDA map. You can find this on screwworm.gov. It is updated on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So this is what the current map of screwworm infestations looks like through yesterday at 5 p.m. So 1,674 active animal cases currently, the northernmost being about 64 miles from the U.S. border in Nuevo Leon. Um, I had said so initially, so many of these cases were a result of human movement, and people moving animals up the highway. Increasingly, we're seeing de novo cases in Mexico, and those are cases occurring at the animal's point of origin. So you'll have a newborn calf or a sick pig or something like that that has been on a farm or a ranch for some time, and and they come down with a screwworm infestation, and that's really um, an established mature fly population at that point. So some a challenge that we're seeing is that's not being reflected in traps that are in northern Mexico. Um, Most of the surveillance in Mexico has been passive, has been at inspection stations and that sort of thing. You can see here that teal polygon at the top is where currently those 100 million flies from Panama are being dispersed. I think those maps were just adjusted to include a couple more counties in South Texas. All that is predicated on modeling that the USDA is doing to stay ahead of spread of the fly. Um, you see there at Moore Air Base there in Edinburgh just came online recently for the dispersal of flies. They're currently under construction for a fly production facility that should come online, as if I recall, end of 2027. That'll certainly add to our capacity and our ability to address this spread. So we have a lot of new challenges. and some new opportunities, but some challenges that are different from the last time that we dealt with screwworms here in the United States. A big one, particularly here in the state of Texas, is that there are 2.5 million feral hogs on the landscape that kind of persist as a resilient transmission vector for screwworms across private acreage. Obviously, very difficult to control. Populations continuing to explode. To manage to keep a local population in check or flat, you need to remove 75% of a sounder in order to just keep it growing year over year. And so feral hogs are certainly a challenge that we didn't have in the 1960s and 70s. A growing percentage of rural land is under absentee ownership, making surveillance and making surveillance just much more difficult than it has been in the past. And we have some fewer tools when it comes to the treatment of livestock animals. And the passage of TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, in 1976, administered by the EPA, has regulated the use of some of these, as I mentioned, caustic uh, treatment tools that had previously been applied to animals. And so many of those are no longer authorized for use in the United States. There were some emergency authorizations made available by the FDA that the Animal Health Commission is currently overseeing for that folks can use, um, can purchase and use now. But again, for wildlife, that is just not it's not going to be n not going to be a part of the solution. I know there are other discussions, and maybe we'll talk about this in the Q&A later on. Ivermectin laced feed and supplemental feed and things like that, and what would go into that. I think there are just a handful of questions that still need to be answered. We also have a lot of opportunities, right? Predictive artificial intelligence, as I mentioned, the USDA is really leaning into this tool as they model out the future path of this fly and the movement of the fly and where they can stay ahead of that in dispersing sterile flies on the landscape and working with local communities to uh, educate the public on where this might be 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months from now. There's advancements in entomological research, and I'm sure Dr. Swiger will talk a good deal about that. And we've also had a fair bit of runway here. So we've been about 18 months since that first detection in Mexico in late 2024. And that has afforded us the ability to prepare somewhat. And I think our government partners are certainly doing their best with what they have to do that. I know a lot of our TWA and our partner organizations are supporting them as best we can to make sure they have the tools and resources they need to keep this in check. Uh, Most importantly, one thing that hasn't changed is that landowners are going to be on the front lines of screwworm surveillance, control, and eradication. Uh, Landowners, ranchers were really the engine in beating back this fly a half century ago in applying treatments and surveilling the landscape, and in a lot of ways, bringing about the funding and political motivation to stand up sterile fly facilities. And that is proving to be the case again. That's the reason that we are hosting this webinar today, and are going to be continuing to provide updates on screwworm spread, best practices when it comes to sample collection and carcass treatment and all sorts of those things, just to make sure that we're doing the best we can on the landscape to manage this spread. And that is so important um, because of what's at stake. And I mentioned this a bit earlier. We have a $10 billion hunting economy in Texas that is central to rural community, to the vitality of our rural communities. We have uh, what about 5 million, just short of 5 million white-tailed deer on the landscape. Anecdotally, there's been we've heard stories in the past of 75% fawn mortality local to screwworm infestations. So it is uh, easy to imagine what how that would have a population level impact on white-tailed deer in the state, and the economic impact just multiplies in a negative way there. Um, Similarly, a huge economic cost for livestock agriculture in the state. Just looking at, I mentioned the 1976 infestation. There was a infestation rate of 20% in cattle. In sheep and goats, that was just shy of 10%. But uh, mortality, um, weight loss, just lost value is tremendous. The cost of hundreds of millions of dollars to the Texas economy, and projecting that out onto to 2024, USDA has estimated a potential cost of $1.8 billion to the state. I should make clear that that cost does not include the graphic on the left, that really that shines a light on the impact to wildlife. So in 2024, I think it was the Sunday after Thanksgiving, Texas Wildlife Association was notified of the by the Animal Health Commission of the infestation in Mexico. We pretty quickly organized with several statewide livestock partner groups in putting together the Screwworm Coalition of Texas, and we have been meeting weekly since. We have a website, www.screwwormtx.org, and our groups have been doing a lot of web and in-person education, testifying before the state legislature and meeting with staff, briefing staff on what potential impacts there are to our industries in the state and communities in the state, and then supporting the USDA and Department of Interior in addressing their resource needs through the appropriations processes in DC, and supporting the development and then continued revision of their response playbooks. The USDA's response playbook, I think, is on its 2.0 version now, and we've been actively communicating with those federal agencies to ensure that it is responsive to and addresses the real needs, and has an application for landowners, and it's not just um, a document that isn't relevant on the landscape. So appreciate their cooperation with that. Um, I'll mention so on the subject of partnered events, we have two coming up this summer that are going to feature a good bit of educational content on the new World Screwworm, both with regard to sample collection, but also assessing your risk tolerance on your property, um, with regard to potential screwworm infestation and managing your herds in accordance with that. So we're excited to put on these programs here in August. The Trans-Pecos Wildlife Conference is August 5th through 7th. South Texas Wildlife Conference is August 28th. Registration is open for both, and we hope you'll join us. I'm sure we'll have a handful of questions, or they're probably already rolling into the chat, but I'll take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Sonja Swiger, who is who's based in Stephenville and a professor at the Texas A&M Department of Entomology and an extension specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife. Her research and teaching work is in the field of managing nuisance biting flies and disease vectoring insects that impact the health of cattle and other livestock, wildlife, and humans. So you can see why we gave her a call. Dr. Swiger plans, conducts, and participates in educational programs for pest management of arthropods and diseases attacking livestock, companion animals, and public health. She is currently serving as the president of the Southwestern branch of the Entomology Society of America and president of the Texas Mosquito Control Association. So, Dr. Swiger, thank you very much for joining us, and I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Dr. Swiger, let me jump in for just a second. I'm sorry to disrupt you. All I want to do is say, hey, everybody, I got my computer fixed. But I did want to jump in and just let the audience know that we are encouraging questions. We're just not doing it at the end of this first presentation. So please, if you have questions, there's a Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. If you're on your phone, you should be able to tap down there somewhere, see Q&A, an opportunity to write a question in that we will have pitch back to the panelists. If you're not seeing it, hit the button that has the three dots and says more, and it should be an option within that. I'm going to jump out, Dr. Swiger. I'm really excited to see your presentation, and I apologize for disrupting the flow here.
That is okay. So let me pull up my presentation for y'all. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here to speak with y'all today. So as mentioned, I am Sonja Swiger. I'm an entomologist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and I do specialize in livestock pests, which end up technically always being wildlife pests too, if you want to look at it in that capacity, and sometimes even impact humans as well as other pests that do impact humans. So of course, we're going to talk about the New World Screwworm. So thank you, Andrew, for the information you provided. I'm going to expand on some of that and then take us in a little different direction as well to some other areas that you may have some questions about in addition to what was already presented. So just a little bit, again, a little background on the New World Screwworm, and then I'll dive further into it. As it was already mentioned, this is a blowfly species. It is a parasitic blowfly that infests only living tissue. I think it's very important to remember that portion of it, since most blowflies actually infest dead tissue, and that is their preferred form of materials they like to grow their larvae on. So the New World Screwworm will never use dead tissue. It will never use a dead animal, and it never uses manure. It only uses the living tissue of a living host, but that infestation can lead to the death of those animals. So that's, of course, of major concern. It is listed they will infest any warm-blooded animal, but we do see higher numbers in certain groups of animals. One way it's been presented to me is that if you have more of a certain species in an area where the fly is present, you will see higher incidences of that species being infested. But a lot of the data we see out of Mexico does show a high correlation to livestock at this moment, where the cattle are 67% of those numbers that are being infested at this time. But it's important to remember that they're not actually doing active surveillance of the wildlife, which we know is another major concern, starting with deer, because deer are a high numbered species and they definitely will utilize them as a host. Other animals of concern, as mentioned, would be humans, pets, and birds, which these flies can attack if they're in an area and they find them useful. So this fly species, Cochleomya hominivorex, a very unique name, but it means man-eater, and it's a very good name for them because, again, that is what they are able to do. But again, it's not just man; it is going to be animals. These infestations are deadly. Without intervention by humans, these animals will succumb almost always to an infestation, and that's just because that feeding habitat or habit of those flies, which is the larva stage, generally can happen in areas on the body that are vital or close to vital organs that will lead to the death by that feeding, or it could be a toxicity reaction, or there could be a secondary infection that may come in after the feeding of these larvae or these maggots, if you want to refer to them as that. So the flies are not heavily numbered. So that is a list. One of the best things we could probably say about them is that you're not going to find them in large numbers. You're not going to find a huge abundance of these flies. That's good and bad. Good because that lessens the amount of attacks we would see in an area, but it's bad because it also eliminates our ability to structure management around the fly adult stage. But so they're very low numbered. They do prefer to be in wooded and vegetated areas, and they do have some temperature preferences that I'll get into in the next slide or two. We do know from previous research and information that they don't have the ability to travel over large bodies of water, which at times can be beneficial, but unfortunately with this current outbreak is not beneficial because there is no large body of water keeping them from coming into the United States from Mexico if that was to happen in this situation. In the past, and when I say in the past, as it was mentioned, they were here a long time ago. They did live in many of the states of the U.S. They are native to the Americas, so they were naturally found in North America, Central America, and South America. They still reside to this day in Central America, or I'm sorry, in South America and in the Caribbean islands. So all the Caribbean islands still are potentially have the ability to have this fly, minus Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and then North America and Central America because we did eradicate them. But when they were found here back in their natural state before we took them on and got the and achieved eradication, they could be found in many of our southern states, specifically in the southwestern side of the U.S., which is seen here in kind of these hash lines. That was what would happen in the spring, summer months. We would see movement of these flies back up into our more northern states, such as Oklahoma and Nebraska and Kansas, as well as maybe out west. A lot of that spread is not necessarily by the flies themselves, but by humans moving animals for many purposes, which would allow for that spread, or maybe wildlife expanding their ranges in those warmer months. Um, they do have some temperature preferences, which is roughly, in the 80s is kind of a great temp, right? So very active between 60s and the 90s degrees. There is some lesser activity when we start to get to these end time temperature periods. But as an entomologist, I try to not put too much emphasis on these parts of the temperature because they can still function at these cooler temps and at these higher temps that are out of their typical preferred range. They just would have lesser activity is how to look at that. It's not that they're completely gone at all times. There just may be less activity occurring at that moment. So, as it was mentioned to me that there's a possibility that a few of you could come from more of a closer area to Del Rio. So I chose to find the temperatures of the Del Rio area on a monthly basis, as we would say, the minimum and maximum, and place them over this graph here. But what this graph is showing is what we would see with temperature activity periods for this fly. So what you're also noting is that this probably isn't too out of the ordinary for most fly species. So as an entomologist, when I look at this in Texas, and I've been in Texas almost 18 years, I'm like, okay, yep, that's when we see fly activity. So March to basically Christmas, right? So it can be almost year round for some people, depending on where you're listening in from today. You may be in the southern half of the state, and it is a year-round issue to deal with flies, and this would be another fly that could survive year-round. If you're calling from more central to northern areas of the state, you would at least get some relief during the winter months when we actually have real winter. This past winter was kind of unique. It was kind of mild, so we could still have fly activity, and we did still have fly activity in the wintertime. But if these temps start to drop into the 40s, you are going to see probably no fly adult activity. It does impact them quite severely in that because that most insects do need warmer temps to function. And if you get up into these high 90s and into the hundreds, I wouldn't say they're going to disappear, but you just may not have as much reproduction, maybe not as much activity going on because those high temperatures can impact their fecundity rates, right? Their reproductibilities and things of that sort. But for the most part, if you're in the southern half of the state, it is very problematic if this fly returns because it could be present year round and be an issue you'd have to deal with year round. So there are other flies that may look like Cochleomya hominivorax. Since it is a blowfly, it is what we would call a robust metallic fly. That's kind of the terminologies we use to describe the blowfly grouping. There are about 20 or so different species of blowflies in Texas, and probably more than that in some of our states north of us, because their temperature ranges do allow for more diversity in those fly species. What you're seeing here on the screen, though, is there's actually two different flies in these pictures. So you got three pictures. The one on the right is Cochleomya macellaria. That is not the New World Screwworm. The one on the left is Cochleomya hominivorax, which is the New World Screwworm. And really, for most people, those look almost exactly the same. So these are two species of blowflies that are very closely related to each other, seeing how they're both in the same genera, which is that Cochleomya, and they're actually both referred to as a screwworm in some capacity. So the New World Screwworm, again, is on the left. The secondary screwworm is on the right. The reason we like to bring this up and talk about it is because of their close appearance to each other, and their behavior can be very similar. Um, the other part of that is Cochleomya macellaria is a very prolific species. We find it all over the state at all the times. So it is a species of blowfly that you can find almost every day if you're in the right location. Now, in the northern half of the state, you're not going to have it active in the wintertime, but you would have activity with this fly in the southern part of the state all the time. So we want people to be aware that you're going to potentially see something that may look like the New World Screwworm. And I'm probably going to be able to say about 95% of the time, maybe more, it's not New World Screwworms. Because New World Screwworms are so low in numbers, it's very, very, very hard to actually collect them in the adult stage. And it's very rare to find them in the adult stage. And that is not true with Cochleomya macellaria. There are features we would use as entomologists and with USDA, which does the official identification of these species, especially in the larva stage, is there are different characteristics we look at, such as different colorations on the wing and the back of the head, and then some CD that circulate the eyes, as well as some other features. So they do have some distinct features that are recognizable to trained people, but to individuals who are not heavily exposed to blowflies, they will look very much alike. So I want to break the life cycle down a little more. We've already talked a little bit about it, and hopefully grasp the concept that, again, this fly does reside and live on animals. Their whole life cycle is really dependent on that. The adult flies are generally found off host, especially males. Males do not interact with animals. Both males and females do consume nectar as a food source. That's their carbohydrates, right? Their sugars. But an adult female will also go and visit animals with womb secretions, and they'll feed off of those secretions of those wounds, and that's how they get the protein to allow them to produce eggs. So once those females are ready to lay those eggs, they'll go hunt for a host, so an animal that has some type of a breakage in the skin that allows them to put their eggs there. Those eggs will then hatch after about 12 hours, and then they'll turn into larvae. The larva will then feed on the living tissue of this animal for about 5 to 7 days. After that point, they will leave the body of that animal and they will pupate on the ground, which takes about another week. This entire life cycle takes roughly about 20 days or so. It's about 21 to 18, so there is different ranges. So relatively close to 20 days to go from the egg to an adult. So within less than a month, you can get a new generation. And of course, once we start seeing advanced activity, we'll have generations emerging, not all at the same time. So asynchronous in that situation. One of the really important things to start thinking about is what and where would they want to lay these eggs. So again, the female's not going to lay eggs on an animal that doesn't have some type of opening that the larva can get through. And one of the reasons is these larvae do not have the ability to break the skin themselves. They have to have a breakage already there for them. The larvae are really small when they first come out of the eggs. So you kind of have to think like a fly in a sense of where do they want to go. One of the most heavily targeted areas of concern for egg laying is going to be the umbilicus of a newborn animal. So this umbilicus up here in this upper picture is either that of a cow or a lamb. I do apologize for not remembering exactly which species of animal that is. But it doesn't matter what species of animal that is because they're still going to be interested in laying their eggs around those umbilicus areas. So even with deer, that's going to be a high commodity and that's going to be of major concern. So they are going to attack those animals, those newborn animals. Other areas of concern may be ears. So as seen in this picture, this deer in particular did have a tag in. Well, that tag did allow for a wound, which again, not saying it's a nefarious wound. It happens because you put a tag in the ear, but because the flies were in the area, that allowed them to access that, and then the larvae started feeding on the ear of that animal. Now, a lot of the other things listed here, we usually speak when we point out when we're talking to livestock owners, and there may be some here in the crowd, so I do want to briefly mention them, but these may not necessarily pertain to wildlife, but castration sites are another major concern, and as well as dehorning. I don't anticipate you all are doing those with those animals that you have, if you do have exotics in captivity or anything like that. But again, it is important to realize that a lot of our customary practices can lead to an access point for these eggs to enter into those animals. Another thing of concern when dealing with eggs is that while the newborn animals will be a main target, so could the mom after birth of that newborn animal. So we have to worry about the mother deer if it's early on, because she could be targeted as well. Or again, if you have exotics and after they've given birth, they would also be a place of concern because they will attack the vulva area of most animals, so they will attack that region of that animal after birth, which can be of major concern. So each fly will lay about 200 to 300 eggs at a time, but each fly can lay more than 200 to 300 eggs in their lifetime. So we do know they can lay up to 1,000 eggs. They may be able to lay more if they're a very efficient fly. And again, each of those eggs will hatch within about 10 to 12 hours. Another major concern is you generally don't get just a single female fly attacking the animal. What you see in the picture here is actually a situation where the second female has come in to lay eggs after another female already laid her eggs. And that a lot of times is what's going to happen. So you'll end up with hundreds to thousands of eggs on an animal at a single site. And then that, of course, produces thousands of larvae, which will be feeding on this animal, and that becomes a majorly severe situation. The other thing is you generally will see other blowflies eventually laying their eggs that are not screwworms, but they're laying them there because the tissue will start to die at that feeding site. So the screwworm larvae, they are blowfly larvae. They look like most white maggots. If you've ever experienced white maggots, either because you have lost an animal and had to deal with the situation or found an animal that had passed, you're generally going to find white fleshy maggots on them, and that's the blowfly larva for the most part. And sometimes we get them in our trash. So if you live in Texas, I'm sure at some point you've had them in your trash. But again, they do look very similar to other maggots, but thankfully they do have some unique features that do allow us to easily identify them from other maggots, and that's extremely important, right? So it would be much harder if these were a species of maggot that was not easily identifiable. That would make things even more difficult than it already is. Sometimes the feeding behavior can be used as a way to say yes or no, we have screwworms, or at least to initially think, okay, maybe this is or is not an actual screwworm infestation, because they are known to technically go in a screw-like fashion into the flesh. So they stay secure into that feeding behavior, and they do position themselves with their mouth hooks down and their posterior spiracles out to the outside of the body of that animal. Some other features which are shown here in these pictures. So the upper top left picture shows the mouth hooks of those maggots. They're pretty prominent for New World Screwworm. I would not use that as an identification tool, but it is just a feature we've noticed about them. The one that is most obvious and most efficiently used for identification is going to be these two dark lines. So this upper picture on the right, as well as the one below it, show these very dark black lines going from the posterior spiracles into the body of the maggot. Those are the tracheal tubes. And New World screwworms are the only blowfly maggots to have those really dark tracheal trunks. So thankfully, we have something like that can help elude people who have the education and the knowledge to be like, hey, this may be the species we're looking for. So we would then take those in and obviously look for other features to get official confirmation. But if we do see maggots on an animal, and I'll get more into this, they do have to be submitted to the USDA's National Veterinary Services Laboratory for expert identification. So they are the ones that have to give the final yes or no that this is or is not New World screwworms, or this is a different species and this is what you have. So on these lower two pictures, the picture here on the left on the bottom picture is actually Cochlearia macellaria, and I wanted to show it compared to this one on the right, which is the Cochlearia hominivorax. So again, you have your New World screwworm on the right picture on the bottom, and you have the secondary screwworm on the left. Just to kind of show again, they do not have those dark tracheal trunks in the maggot stage for the secondary screwworm. They also have some uniqueness and differences in the spination, which is the spines that circulate the body segments of each of these maggots. So we can also use those spines as an identification tool. When these maggots first hatch out, they are very small and about 2 millimeters in size, and then they grow into a much larger size, which gets to about an inch or so in size. So that obviously once they get full grown, which is that third instar stage, they're going to be causing a lot of damage. Early on, they're going to be unnoticeable. We probably won't even realize they're there. But after a few days, they start to have this smell that comes from the wound. So one of the ways of identifying if you're dealing with a situation could be the smell. So if you have the ability to get close to the animals and you start to smell something peculiar, which would be probably like rotting material or a dead carcass, and you don't find a dead carcass, that would be cause for concern because it could be a feeding site for New World screwworms. The other thing you will see is going to be bloody discharge coming from those feeding sites. So that's another way to kind of look and see or give you indication to go look further and see if maybe there are maggots feeding in that wound. Because a lot of these wounds, and I do have a few pictures that'll be coming up, they can be very small in what you probably or might be picturing if you haven't dealt with these before. So they're not always these large, obtrusive, and grotesque situations where you're like, oh my gosh, I can see those maggots from so far away. They could be very small and intricate and hard to see. Now, the pictures here are both. We've got one on the top where it's a very grotesque situation. It's a very intense situation and impact and infestation, but the one on the bottom is not. So it is important to realize that these wounds will not always look exactly the same. Now, these both are animals, both pictures of these animals are dogs, as you can see. So dogs are also very heavily infested. I know we're talking wildlife, but everybody has dogs, right? So we do need to protect the dogs as well. I would say these two dogs may or may not have had actual caretakers. I would definitely say the one on the top did not, and that's how it ended up in that situation. Some other things I want to point out is you can see again that bloody discharge from that paw, right around that paw in the bottom picture. And then the one on the top, you can see how tightly packed in those larvae are. And I know that's a very offensive picture in a sense, but it's important to really see and grasp what kind of an impact we can have on these animals. Again, not treating these would lead to the death of these animals. If it's not the exact feeding, which the upper one is clearly a feeding issue that would kill that animal, it would be an infection that comes in after that infestation. And to reiterate, newborns are 100% susceptible to screwworm infestations. So after the larva stage has finished growing, again, it's about a 5 to 7 day period, they will leave the body of that animal, and at that time they will actually burrow onto the ground. So you're not going to find pupa on the host of the animal. They're going to leave the body, and they will then burrow themselves most of the time into the soil. They can go pretty far. I've heard different numbers. Again, I will say I'm not 100% sure, and there will be lots of variability in the depth of which they'll burrow because it depends on the topsoil, right? What they can get through. But we know they prefer to get a little bit into the dirt, and the main reason is they're looking for a dry location so that they can basically, secure themselves, prevent predation and things like that, and then they'll allow for that exoskeleton, the cuticle, to harden up for this fly to turn into the pupa, and then they're changing from there into the adults. Um, it is important to understand that an infected animal is not contagious to another animal. And what we mean by that is that the larva uh, in an animal that you do identify as being infested will never leave the body of that animal and go to another animal. The only way you can get a newly infested animal is to have adult flies. So our main target of approach is to stop that life cycle before we get to the adult flies, because that's again the only way you can get a new infestation. Um, as you can see in this lower picture, this is a situation where it actually happened in Florida when we had a key deer infestation that I'm going to talk a little more about in later in slides. But they did have these, this one animal in particular has these 4 small puncture wounds that kind of also reiterates the fact that sometimes these do go unrecognizable because you can't really see those wounds from afar, but they're all packed full of maggots. The other point of pointing that out is that if you did have an animal, especially when we're dealing with wildlife, that are infested and they do unfortunately not survive that infestation. Now, I can't say that these 4 small puncture wounds are the reason this animal may or may not have survived this infestation. It could have had another wound of concern. But if you don't notice these small wounds and you decide to just discard with that carcass and not appropriately discard of it, which is in a way that kills the larva, those larvae will just leave the body of that dead animal and forward on into their life cycle. So we do still have to be aware that a dead animal does not equal dead larva. So if you do lose an animal because of maggots and it is New World screwworms, we still have to kill all those maggots that are on that body of that animal. And I know sometimes that seems kind of strange, like, well, the animal's not alive. Why do I still need to invest in it? Well, the larvae are not dead, and the larvae will not die just because the host died. So they do have the ability to shorten their life cycle, which I just went through. It's 20 days, but if they needed to shorten it, they can, because they're flies, right? They're insects. They know how to do that. So it's very important that we properly process any dead carcasses. What they did in Florida back when they had their outbreak is they utilized incinerators and freezers. I'm not saying that's what we're going to necessarily have to do here in Texas, but it is something that we have under consideration, is that we would need to burn carcasses. They have said that burying them may be an option, but the disadvantage there is it needs to be at least 4 feet deep. And there may be places in which we can't dig 4 feet into the soil. So some other things have been passed around about how would we secure these larvae to prevent them from leaving the body and getting into the soil. Freezing is another method, but it does take, you want to freeze them for as many days as possible, because you got to be sure the larvae have frozen to death. And sometimes just a few hours is definitely not going to be enough, as well as maybe bagging of an animal to make sure the maggots stay inside a plastic bag. So just want to point out that adult female or adult fly again, which this one is a female, but I shouldn't have called it that, but but an adult fly, again, just to notice some characteristics about it. Again, it does look a lot like some other blowflies, so please don't get too freaked out if you do see a blowfly. We're here to help. Definitely, you can always send pictures in for identification, but again, you can see the blue-green coloration of this fly, the red eyes, which is very typical of many of our blowflies. They are metallic, so they're shiny, and they do have those 3 stripes that go down the back, which is referred to as the thorax. So it was mentioned a little earlier about the concern of the movement of these flies and how this outbreak has led to these multiple infestations. It's very important to note that screwworm movement does have a lot more to do with humans and the animals themselves than it does the flies themselves. So a lot of our unfortunate situations we've dealt with have been because humans have moved animals that were infested. But it's also important to realize that sometimes this is not done intentionally, actually, probably a lot of times. So this picture here is not a very large entry point into this animal, but what you can hopefully see is there are 3 adult flies, there's eggs, and there are larvae in here. So if this animal was to be loaded up onto a truck and moved without intense inspection prior to movement, you may not even recognize that because that hole is probably not much bigger than a $50, right? So it's not a huge hole, probably 3, maybe 4 inches in diameter. And if you have a large animal, that's not a very big area in which you're looking for. And without, again, intense inspection, it could go unrecognized. Now, the flies can fly. I mean, right? I mean, they are blowflies. They do have wings, but their travel distance is generally only 6 miles or so. We do know that there's been records of them going up to 12 miles, but they don't always go up to 12 miles. So while insects can fly, many of them have wings. It doesn't mean all of them use their wings. And what would happen in this situation, in a sense, is that just because there is ability for that blowfly to travel long distances, why it needs to have a reason to travel long distances. So most of the time, they're not going to travel real far. And, we are very concerned with the impacts right now and with the closeness of the cases to our southern border, but it's still too far of a distance for those flies to make it on their own. We still have to be more concerned about somebody moving an animal than the flies. But once the flies get in and established into an area, then we start looking at that approach. So historically, the distribution zone was in the southern part of Texas and in the southwestern part. What's the takeaway points from this map here is just to kind of show the data from the 50s. So this is the summer or the winter of 1951, which was a mild winter from the data supported here, in which they were able to overwinter into this medium blue color zone of Texas, which is a great area of Texas, right? So that and anything south is where these flies were able to survive in the winter of that year. In addition to, we have to worry about them moving and the movement of animals outside of that winter period into these other adjacent states, which are still something of concern if this fly was to, and if it does reemerge into Texas and the United States. So the interventions for eradication are very important, and this is provided in the playbook that USDA has put together and that Andrew mentioned a little bit ago. If you wanted to look into that further, you can find it on screwworm.gov. But the main 3 pillars are surveillance, movement controls, and sterile insect techniques, which that's the usage of the sterile flies, which is the most important and most needed part of this whole thing for eradication. But you can't eradicate solely just by usage of flies. You still have to do the other things, which is the surveillance and the monitoring of animals. And I'm going to get further into that here in a few slides. So they have put together in this playbook the expected emergency response, then how things will be handled. Since this is a regulated fly species, it is run through USDA APHIS, so from the federal level down into the state level, and each state can be different. So Texas is set up that it would go from there into Texas Animal Health Commission and the Texas Parks and Wildlife, depending on which side of the animals we're talking here, and they would run things at the local level. But it is a unified response that is necessary, along with protection and observations of all animals, as well as managing these flies. And it will require some restrictions that will hopefully just be very temporary in that situation. One of those things that have been put forth is that these restricted areas in preventing basically the movement of the flies. And that's the whole point of these restriction zones, and that they would be temporary to allow animals to be moved safely out of those areas after they've been inspected appropriately and treated appropriately. If those animals are not going to be moved because there was no intention to, they would still be inspected and treated to keep them from getting infested if they're inside these zones. These zones will be 20 kilometers from that initial area or animal of infestation, and then they will expand another 20 outside of that to be what we would call the adjacent surveillance zone. Now, in the adjacent surveillance zone, it may not be as restrictive. There would still be observations for looking for flies to ensure that they haven't moved past that initial zone on their own. And then obviously all of these areas, as much as possible, would be treated with these sterile flies at the same time as looking at inspecting animals and treating them. So our management system is based off on an integrated pest management approach, which means that we want to attack the fly as much as possible in many different ways. And that's how you best achieve management of any pest. Now it is a little tricky with this one because it is a little harder for us to really attack the adult stage, but what we do is the surveillance for the adult stage. Um, that at least gives us some way of watching them. Now, it is very rare to catch the adult, so one caught screwworm is one too many. So that just kind of elaborates how hard it is to find them and how infrequently we encounter them. What would happen, of course, is our main goal is to eradicate, but in order to eradicate, we have to report it. So the most important thing of this entire process is reporting any suspicious situations and ensuring that they're not actual screwworms, but even if they are, we still have to report it all because we definitely need to get out there and do what is necessary to remove it from that location. Another major part of this is monitoring for larvae, which is animal inspections. And that, of course, is tough, especially if you're dealing with exotics that you may or may not have the ability to access or get up close and personal to, and extremely even harder when we're dealing with the wildlife populations. As I mentioned in the last slide, there will be some inspection and limits on animal movement. That would be more impacting, obviously, to our commodities in which animals are being, you know, um, moved around, such as cattle or even swine and things of that sort, probably more so than what we would anticipate with wildlife, because we can't really restrict wildlife that don't have caretakers, but we would also want to try and look at them as much as possible if they're in that area. And then the last part, which I mentioned already, is the sterile insect technology, which is the release of those sterile flies. So it was already talked a little bit about, but I wanted to dive a little more into what is that process. And this is done at the facility currently in Panama with future facilities coming back in online, so to speak, but being re-established or rebuilt. At this location in Panama, they rear these flies in captivity. They have done this since literally the beginning of the 2000s. They have it figured out very well. They know how to do this and in mass numbers. Generally, they're producing 100 million plus flies per week, and we release 100 million flies per week. These flies are both males and females, but they're all sterile because once they have grown them and they pupate, they do radiate them with cobalt 90 before releasing them into the zones, which is determined based on the situations we're dealing with. These releases are mostly done by plane. They have these small little planes in which they chill the flies down and load them up into, and then they use a conveyor belt and some high-tech technology, right, to figure out how many flies need to be deposited in an area. They can also use ground chambers for the pupa when they see that to be the more appropriate approach for releasing these sterile flies. Again, these are done continuously. This facility is constantly running in Panama, and right now, last I heard, they were releasing at 42 dispersals per week. And again, that's multiple times a day, multiple days a week. So they're not just releasing all 100 million at the exact same time. The old school method, if anybody's online that had seen these before, was using these box that were dropped from the plane. But now they do have this more high-tech approach that seems to be a bit more efficient at dispersing and getting into more areas to make sure we get better coverage. And one of the other reasons these work so well is because the males are really good at finding the females, and they're actually way better than humans are at finding these females. So once they're sterile and they mate, they no longer can produce offspring. So that's a great utilization and a great tool that we're very thankful was developed so long ago. Now we do have more facilities being planned or in construction would be the appropriate terminology. So one will be down in the southern portion of Mexico. That facility is an old fruit fly facility that's being converted for sterile flies for screwworms. It should be ready here very shortly. It's supposed to be ready mid 2026, so by the summer or in the summer of 2026. And then our newest facility will be up here where this upper blue star is, and that will be in Edinburgh, Texas. And that one is just now starting construction, and it will be ready by 2020, the end of 2027, at least stage one of that facility, which will give us another 100 million flies. So with that facility in Edinburgh and the facility in Mexico, both of those are expected to do 100 million flies each, which would increase us by 200 million in addition to the 100 million we're already producing in Panama, and we desperately need all of those flies, if not more. We really do need more. The other thing is we're working on waiting on the approval from EPA to hopefully release a male-only strain, which would assist in the operations as well. These are just some pictures from that dispersal facility to see the plane that they utilize and how that rig is set up. They're also using a kind of like a dye glow on the pupa that released in Texas to allow for us to find them faster in the wild, because it actually makes them glow under a black light. So if we do encounter any adults, we can easily identify them as the sterile adults and not any wild type, which is of course major concern. Now, I know this is already presented, so I'm not going to break the slide down, but the reason I added it back in is I wanted to show our dispersal facility zone as well. So the blue-green area up at the top of the map, which is the southern part of Texas, is our polygon for fly dispersal. So they have modified this, and they are now coming 50 miles, and they have been coming 50 miles into Texas, but now they're going further north, which may or may not encompass where some of you actually reside at this time. So those flies are being released in that zone to better protect us from the cases we have been seeing in Mexico. And so we have now had a few new cases that popped up in Cajula, Mexico, and I apologize if I completely said that wrong. And that did begin from a moved incident situation. So both those cases and the most northern cases in Nuevo Leon were unfortunately due to cattle being moved, probably without approval, but they did get moved. And then once they do get to those areas, our biggest concern is to watch if the flies establish. So far, we are seeing those being taken care of, which is great, but they are still really close to our border. They're less than 100 miles. I believe the one that was 60 miles from the border has been resolved without any further incidents. At least that's what I'm seeing on the map. So hopefully that stays that way, and we can kind of get some of these cases moved further back from the southern border and protect us. So management considerations, if we do have anybody online that does have cattle, obviously if you're livestock, you do need to call Texas Animal Health Commission, but so do exotics. So if anybody's on that is an exotic animal owner, that goes back to Texas Animal Health Commission. So you do need to contact him with any concerns if you see any maggots and if you're out there monitoring. If you're not monitoring, it's time to start. Especially if you're in South Texas, you need to start taking time to figure out, how am I going to inspect my animals? How am I going to get up to them in time close enough that I can actually see anything on them? If you do not have exotics or you do not have livestock, then you're going to go back to Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to report those situations. And I'm going to get into that here in a few minutes. So this was kind of mentioned, but again, if you're not familiar, Texas has a lot of wildlife, right? So we have 100 million species, or 100 mammal species, sorry, I read that wrong, and over 5 million of those are white-tailed deer, and that's the species we're most concerned about at this moment, but that they're not the only ones. So pigs could also be impacted by them, as well as any other wildlife species we have. And the most important thing we can do is surveillance. So monitor as frequently as possible. Even though that's not going to be an easy task, it is a necessary task. Keep records, a field or ranch notebook. If you are a wildlife observer, or if you own them or you have them in captivity, you need to start taking notes of what's happening now to see if changes happen in the future. Utilize technology, so the addition of cameras, which I'm sure most of you probably already have these cameras, so start looking at them. If you see something suspicious, please report that back. That would be some type of a weird wound on your animals, weird behavior. Shaking their heads is something they're known to do because they're being eaten by maggots, or some type of a wound with a bloody discharge coming out of it. Wildlife surveys, as well as viewing from when you're up hunting, if that's something you do, or just wildlife viewing. If you're up high, you see something unique or out of the ordinary, please take time to report that. Make a note, get your coordinates of where you are, and then contact your local biologist, which I'll have that information here in just a slide or two. Different times of the year are more concerning. So again, I did put the temps for Del Rio in, and what would be similar to any of you in that same area or south of there in Texas. And this is now overlaid our fly activity over top of when we have our most changes in obviously the deer population. So when antlers are being shed, um, they're at high risk because they will come in and attack them at that time period. Obviously, when offspring are being produced, that is definitely going to be a major concern. As I've already mentioned, they're highly susceptible there. And then if they're have a little bit of a rough over a female, right? So breeding and fighting, things of that sort, that will lead to other wounds. So that one deer I showed, it clearly looked like they had been punctured by another antler because it had that 4 puncture wounds on the side. So that definitely leads to major exposure for these animals to be attacked by these flies. If you are a wildlife rehabber, this is actually an opportunity that can help where you can lead to further inspection. So in addition to what you're doing to save those animals, to assist with their uh, productivity and their availability, you also want to take time to look at their bodies to be sure they don't have any infestations or any wounds that may become infested. Again, report, 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 right? Surveillance is important, so is reporting. So if you see something out of the ordinary, please contact your wildlife biologist. They are the lead for Texas Parks and Wildlife on this situation, but you can contact a game warden if that's somebody you know or anybody that works for the system, and they will help get you to that biologist. But please record what you've seen. Please record the day, the time, and obviously the coordinates. Why, yes, animals may move, but if they're heavily infested, they're not going to move very far because they're not going to feel up to it. I don't want to get into detail into the situation that happened in Florida, but I wanted to put out some key information that we did learn from this incident. So if you're not familiar with this was back in 2016. They did have an outbreak on the Big Pine Key, and this did lead to the death of 135 key deer, unfortunately. This could have easily been prevented, or at least that severe of an infestation and impact, if people would have just reported it sooner. So it ended up that a dog had been seen with maggots and cleared of maggots back in March of that year, but they were not submitted for identification. And that is a severe issue of concern, and we don't want to have that happen here in Texas because we're prepared. We want to be able to fight it earlier than later so that we can protect these animals. We don't want to lead to the unnecessary death of animals that we could save. And it's very important that people who own animals take the time to inspect them to save the animals that aren't owned, right? So that's kind of the whole key thing here, is to get back to protecting all the animals, and those especially without caregivers, so to speak. Again, most of that mortality at that situation ended up being in the males because it was during their rut season, during that breeding season, during the time that the velvet was coming off the antlers, and it made them most easily exposable to these flies. If it had continued into the fawning season, that would have been a huge impact, obviously, to females and to the future generations of those animals, although it was already a severe impact. And to kind of wrap up this portion of the presentation and what I have to say before we get into Q&A, management is important. It is a little harder, obviously, with wildlife. We do still have a lot that we need to figure out. We do still have a lot of things not unanswered entirely because it does change based on what species we're dealing with. But again, really what's important is to start becoming good stewards of these animals, start protecting them, if nothing else, by making notes and observations, being aware of the typical number of animals you may see in your area. And again, if you have them in captivity, start finding time to figure out a way to inspect them closer. Because again, we are dealing with wildlife, right? We're dealing with exotics, and they're not necessarily accustomed to humans. But if you do have some that are, that's great. But also outside of that is how are we going to manage these problems? Luckily, we have a few products that have come on market, onto the table, so to speak, for usage on exotics. So there's two in particular here that are called F10 antiseptic wound spray, and the other one is the F10 antiseptic ointment. And I highly recommend that you read these labels entirely before usage, but they have been given approval for wild and exotic mammals, and that does include deer. So now when you do get outside of the deer population, you may need to read that label in more detail, but it does have on here captive, wild, exotic, and zoo mammals. So this one is a spray. So if you had a wound on an animal, you could spray that wound. You're basically putting a cover over the wound that prevents access for the fly larva to get into. So that's what you're trying to do here. You still have to be able to access that animal to get that spray onto them. There are withdrawal restrictions. Now, these are going to be for animals that we consume. So do take that in consideration. If your animal's not being consumed by humans, you don't need to worry about that. But if they are, you do need to be sure you read into that. This one is available over the counter, so you don't need a prescription. And then the ointment, very much the same stuff, so I won't spend as much time to talk about it. It's just obviously going to be more of a slab that you would put over it, right? A salve that you would cover it, not going to be a spray. This may or may not be easier to use depending on your animal than if you have the ability to get that close to them, but it is at least available for usage again on wild exotic mammals as well as animals that are at zoos, so captive wild exotics. The most recent one that did come on was back on April 27th. They did announce this product. Now, this is not a product that is available to the general public at this moment, but I did wanted to mention that it is there. So it's called Nagasun, I believe. I haven't heard it pronounced, so I apologize if I screwed that up big time. But you get the gist, right? It is a topical powder that can be applied, and it does have wildlife on it. So it has wild and exotic mammals. Again, there may be some stipulations exactly how many wild. So they think this one does have a little bit of a caveat when it comes to maybe deer. So we do need to make sure that if you do end up have the ability to use this, it would require a veterinarian. So yeah, it does say free ranging wildlife are not allowed to be utilized for this. I don't anticipate that would really be something we would be doing, but that's because of the risk of consumption. So there are withdrawal periods on this as well. But if you do have exotics or captive wildlife, this could be a tool eventually. And I word it that way because, again, this is not authorized for open access usage. It's authorized for USDA now. What it does is it gives us more stuff in our toolbox to use when necessary, and it will require prescription outside of that. So it's not available today, but it is at least now approved by FDA for usage when needed. And just to kind of bring it all back together, all of this, it really comes back to observations and everybody doing and playing their part, which robust surveillance is a necessity. We do have traps already placed into our southern border. They're just outside where we're releasing those flies to keep track of the ones we do release. And hopefully we don't collect them because we want them to do their job, but also to keep track of any that may not be the sterile flies that are in that area as well. Wildlife monitoring, USDA APHIS is already involved in this, so is Texas Parks and Wildlife, and now hopefully you will take the time to get involved in monitoring your wildlife. And there's lots of work being done between Mexico and USDA to work together to control this situation. And yes, it is still moving, still seeing expansion, and we really are still needing a lot more flies to help fight this battle, but we also have more to do than just waiting for the flies. So we definitely need to get prepared for all of that. And with that, I will stop here. I'll leave this up for a minute for anybody who wants to get my contact information, which my email is the best way to contact me. But we also point out the screwworm.gov webpage, which is highly important, has a lot of information, and we also have our Screwworm page at A&M and all of our fact sheets as well.
Thank you, Dr. Swiger.
Yes.
What a very robust overview of this issue. Folks, we have two. I mentioned it yesterday. Experts. Andrew says no, I'm not an expert, but I did tell him. I said, Andrew, if I pull a random 100 people off of the street, you're going to be the expert in the room when we talk about. Well, unfortunately, because we're talking about New World Screwworm so much these days. But folks, we do have the experts here. They're available for another 9 or so minutes till we get to 1:30. If you have questions, please throw them in there. And if it's okay, Dr. Swiger and Andrew, I'll re-ask a couple of questions that I've seen in the Q&A box. Maybe we can touch on them. So a couple of them have been touched on directly. there was a request here, or a question is, would we be able to spray a crop dust style approach on our 2,000-acre ranch? If so, how often, and what would we be able to spray? And there was a second part to that. Yeah, can you use a crop duster as an approach? And I'll let you guys handle that one. I think I know an answer, but I'm not going to pretend to be an expert when y'all are here.
And I'll let Dr. Swiger correct me, but I don't think there is an approved aerial treatment at this point. Anything that can be applied to the landscape like that.
No, there's not. I mean, you're really overlapping into a lot of environmental impacts. You would actually kill more other insects than you ever would the screwworm. The targeting stage is the larva stage, so the crop dusting to control it where it needs to be controlled is not going to be effective. And as mentioned, those flies are so low in numbers that your impact to non-targets, pollinators, and everything of that sort would be so high that this would never be an approved method. So the usage of a crop duster, that goes back to whether or not it's on the label for the product, but the problem is there's no products labeled for this, and I hope and anticipate that that would not be something that will come on the market in the first place.
Thank you. Kind of a similar question coming from our friend Austin Stolte, who is the county biologist for Texas Parks and Wildlife, concerning the dispersal of aerial flies the sterile flies. Do they make the maps publicly available of specific dispersal paths and locations? And do they need landowner permission before release, or at the very least, do they contact landowners along the path before dispersal events?
I'll let you take that one, Dr. Swiger. I don't believe they, beyond a county level, I don't believe they do make that public.
No, since this is a federally regulated invasive pest, I don't think they have to. First off, they do not need to contact the landowner because this goes above and beyond that. And it's not in the best interest for anybody to block the distribution of these flies. These flies have no impact on the environment. They have no impact on animals or other organisms. So there's really no reason to say, no, we can't have it done. But I don't see that that's going to, that you would have an opportunity to, anyways. But having maps, now I know they do them. I don't know where they're sharing them. If they are sharing them, I have seen some out of Panama years ago, but I haven't seen any with this current situation. Um, that may be something we could get access to, but again, I don't know if they are providing that. And no, they don't have the time, and I know that I don't think they're working to contact landowners. But again, this is something that needs to be done, so it's definitely in the best interest to allow it to happen.
Those are good questions, and the types of questions our landowners might like to ask. We always in these rural working lands communities kind of interested in how the government, when they're leading a program, how they're working with landowners. And I think I heard something about maybe there's some potential for the feds to be working with the county commissioners court, perhaps. Maybe that's the best place to get some information on the local level. I'm not certain that that's actually happening, but that would be maybe where we can get a question answered at
Yeah.
that level.
And then I'd like to add to it, it's just, and the other reason it's really best to allow them to disperse as much in as large area as possible is because there's so many animals that would be infested that we wouldn't have knowledge of. So getting those flies to those target zones is really our job, is to hopefully help those males find their females and stop those infestations that are not being recorded, because we're only getting the ones we are recording.
Thank you. The next question I see here comes from Mrs. Welch. Mentions that Andrew has mentioned a possible release of ivermectin-laced feed for wildlife as a possible tactic. Interested in concerns around increased resistance to ivermectin and whether or not that might actually promote the reduced effectiveness.
It's very much a concern, and so I know that there has been an application filed for approval by for the use for the sale of ivermectin laced supplemental feed. We have heard some concern already from the USDA that because of an over application of ivermectin in Central America, that there is some resistance amongst this strain of fly that's moving northward. Um, but that is very much a concern, and I think the degree to it's very difficult to moderate how much a wild animal is eating at a feeder. And so to know the level of effectiveness that you're having in your herd is very difficult to do. Um, Dr. Swiger, I'll let you elaborate on that. I know I'm kind of giving a very basic explanation. I'll let you be a little bit more scientific, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, that's a hot topic, of course, the usage of the feed. So the other part of that is there's no data to support that it's even effective against maggots in the flesh. So obviously there has been usage of the ivermectin feed to help manage some tick species, but ticks are blood feeders, so we do get enough of that material getting into the blood, but there's no data to say that there's enough from food consumption to get into the tissue that has to stay at the right level in order to be taken in by the maggots and then causing the death of the maggots. What they did approve was the usage of ivermectin in cattle only, by injectable only, and only as a preventative. And what does that mean? That means, of course, you can't use it in wildlife, but it also says that this is not the best product because it's not used for the curing of an infestation, it's for the prevention of an infestation. And when you break that down, the data, as you mentioned, has not been favorable. What they're seeing is about a 13 to 10% efficacy of the large larva. So when we do use it, we're killing very, very few larvae, and that's not good. We need to kill 100% of the larva. So
Mm.
yeah, there's a lot of issues with ivermectin because of overusage. It is a great tool in certain capacities, but in this situation, it is not our best option at this time.
I'm going to take one more look in the box to see if there's any other questions that we might be able to address very quickly. I think there's two that I think we can hit on. Number one was, will the F10 product be available at a commercial site like Tractor Supply, or where would you go to maybe look at that?
I looked on Tractor Supply and I couldn't find it. So I am not sure where you find it. It took me a long time to find the official picture of it online. So I've yet gone out and tried to hunt for it myself to purchase it. So I'm really not sure where you can find it at.
Man, yeah, that's going to be tricky. A lot of times when I can't find something from somewhere that I think it should be, I find it on eBay, but I'm going to guess that eBay is not going to be the place for this particular product. So we'll, if we do a little more sleuthing or find a place to source that product, we'll share with the resource page once and distribute that once we find it. But right now, it sounds like it's not going to be Tractor Supply, and we're not sure exactly where the product will come from. Then this will be the last question. We'll call it after this. Would we be able to spray a pesticide on our deer pens, more of a local and focused space, and would that be productive or useful?
Right now, there's nothing labeled. So I
Same.
think I'm going to stop it at that. Like, there's technically nothing labeled that you could be doing that. And that there are a few products that have been put into a list on the USDA site through EPA for approval for treatment to screwworms. So I'd say that there is things on out there. If you look at those, you'd have to read the labels to see if that's a legitimate approved application method. And I think that's where you're going to run into an issue. The other part of that is that is it going to really have an impact is where I look at it. So even though my job is to control insects, I generally want to think about it from the approach of, will that even make a difference? And it may or may not, even if you are spraying, because this fly is not hanging out with the deer, so to speak, or any animal on a regular basis.
This will be that was the last formal question. Here's one that's maybe more of a rhetorical or fun question. Who is our this isn't necessarily a question. This is a text message a friend of mine sent me that's on the call, Colin Farmer. Who is our Dolph Briscoe today? Like, who is the champion representing the landowner's interest in kind of being the head of this issue in Texas? I know that we have a really great coalition of organizations, but who, like, so Dolph Briscoe was the governor, represented the landowners' interest in this issue back in the day. And so is Sid Miller our guy for the time being? What's, who are we looking at as the figurehead for this? Doesn't seem, doesn't seem like there is one, maybe. It's just,
You
it's,
know, I mean, the Animal Health Commission is the lead agency at a state level. I would say Dr. Dingus would be my recommendation there. I know there are several state legislators that are paying close attention to this, and this will be the subject of a hearing in both, I think, the Senate Ag and House Culture, Recreation, and Tourism committees next week. So maybe add Senator Perry and Representative Metcalf to that list. I think they're going to be pretty integral this coming legislative session in making sure that the resources are in place at our state agencies to make sure that they can achieve what they need to in the coming months and years.
Mhm. Great. Thank you both so much for the work you're doing, your organizations, at taking a leadership role in this, and I'm really thrilled. I mean, we may not have a personality as awesome as Dolph's, as Governor Briscoe's, but certainly we have a very well coordinated coalition that's keeping an eye on this issue, sharing information, and being a resource to our landowners and our operators out there. So kudos to you. Kudos to you as individuals and your organizations. Thank you for being here today. And we'll go ahead and call this meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Romy. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much.